It is Monday, November 5th, and it's later in the evening. I usually don't do video blogs in the evening, so we'll see how this goes. And hopefully I don't just get, tired and foggy-headed throughout it. But I had an idea to talk about things relating to the subject of non-duality, which I've kind of tried to avoid conversations with around this topic because it tends to be a pain in the ass to talk about, or that it all but I won't get into that kind of stuff now. But for some reason, there's certain things about this topic which I feel like talking about. So, this train of thought was spurred. I think when I recently went to go see this guy Bruce Sanguin give a talk at Banyan Books, and rather than get into everything about what he was talking about there was one kind of comment that he was making, and I wasn't going to be a jerk and interrupt and try to get to arguments and debates or things like this. Is part of the reason I don't like talking about non-duality. I wasn't going, but one of the comments he was making was, this is all about psychedelic therapy and ayahuasca ceremonies and experiencing mystical states of things like non-duality in those means. But he was talking about how the way he was kind of talking about it, that there's a temptation for spirituality to reach some kind of transcendent, non-dual state and kind of be in the clouds up above everything, when really it's sort of like life is about, coming back down to earth and really getting in there with what your human experience is all about, with all the ups and downs and pains and stuff like that. And that was kind of spurred what I felt like talking about here. And it's, of course, with all this stuff, conversation about non-duality, there's a good chance that I'm just sort of talking shit basically, because it's all just conceptual ideas about it anyways, and it's really beyond what you'd be able to put into language. But something kind of irked me about portraying, because I think it's common for people to talk about these really far out non-dual unity experiences, and that being kind of detached from your ordinary mundane real life. But what bugs me about this, I just had I feel like people are completely missing the point, or that it's think about it. You've got your transcendent non-dual state, you've got your down-to-earth mundane ordinary life. So what is it? You got two things. You've got duality there. That's not non-duality at all. And so it's I think that it's a really, maybe an important thing to talk about, is that to talk what is real non-duality versus a dualistic mysticism or transcendence. And this goes back into themes of when people talk about the Gnostic dualism or dualistic religions, right? And non-duality is an interesting topic because doesn't just mean one thing. For example, in the context of unity experiences, non-duality in that context would mean a non-separation between self and other, or subject and object. That it's just one thing, or there isn't these boundaries or divisions and that would be no bound. And then with mysticism, no boundary between self and God, versus in most Christian mysticism or Christian religions, there's always a kind of a fundamental difference that you can have a relationship with God, but you're never completely. It's never a completely. The division is never completely dissolved. Whereas in more Eastern style practices, like Buddhism, they make a point of being non-theistic, whereas the Buddha is not a god; it's your own Buddha nature, and you're not having this sense of a separate self as being any way apart from whatever spiritual thing there is. So that's one kind of non-duality. There's also non-duality in the sense of the opposites, or the the idea of attraction, aversion, everything in life either being favorable or unfavorable, or you want this to happen, you don't want that to happen, all that kind of stuff. Which obviously is a part of our life to some is going to be part of our life to some extent. I've heard like a line that was that was like there's no restaurants in non-duality, which was saying that like like you go to the restaurant and you look at the menu and it's like, oh well, should I have the fish and chips? Should I have the salad? Should I have the soup? You have to, what do I want to drink with this? And then you eat the meal, and did they is your food up to snuff, or is it like is your something off with your soup, or you're all that. Or what restaurant do you go to? You have these preferences of what you want and what you don't want that kind of play out in your daily life, and so to some extent in our reality there's always going to be some kind of a dualist, or even like the opposite between you're full, but before that you were hungry. That like to have an empty stomach, to have a full stomach. These are all the kind of dualistic opposites that play out in our existence. But there's this is the whole form and emptiness kind of thing. And in Buddhism, there's this kind of, in the Heart Sutra, there's the idea that form is none other than emptiness, emptiness is none other than form, but at the same time, form is form, emptiness is emptiness. So these are just different sides of it. But I think that's kind of like, I think even that kind of thinking, like there's no restaurants in non-duality, I'm kind of questioning that too. There's because it's sort of like, if you like, why can't your what gives you the idea that your French fries are separate from the rest of the universe anyways, right? Like why is going to a restaurant necessarily a dualistic experience, or but this is all just kind of, this isn't the main point of what I'm getting at here. What I think was kind of interesting about these premises of the non-dual state as being some far out transcendent thing that is like you rather than chasing that goal, you have to be grounded in your everyday life. And it's not dualist, it's not non-duality at all. Those are two dualistic things. And I think this is interesting because it actually, if you learn about the archetypes and what they would talk about as the yin and yang, this is from getting into things like Jungianism, and stuff like that. It's interesting because there's archetypal associations in all of this, and the yin and the yang in the Taoist creation, based emerging from this kind of undifferentiated emptiness or nothing, comes the first differentiation, which is the split. And in the Christian creation myth, you see that represented in the story of Adam and Eve. And so you have a masculine and a feminine character. And of course, in the Christian creation myth, Eve is the one who goes for the apple, and in that kind of representing the fall from Eden, or the fall from this kind of the heaven into the manifestation of existence, the earthly plane as we know it. And so you see this in both. Well, maybe this is all just like a Christian archetype. I'm not. To be honest, I'd have to look into my mythology of all the different backgrounds a bit more. But there's generally this principle of what that pair, what they're talking about, of transcendent spirituality, the heaven archetype, which not as an afterlife, but the kind of ethereal, transcendent realm hidden in the clouds above everything, as being a yang or masculine archetype, and the manifestation of earth being a feminine archetype to do with yin, which is also interesting, I think, because I have been interested in astrology, and if you look at the elements, there's 4 elements: fire, air, water, and earth. And the first 2 I mentioned, which are air and fire, things that are less substantial. The fire is things combusting and burning up, and heat and energy, and air being, you can't see it. It's sort of, except for maybe feeling the wind or something. It's being a loose gas, more of a those elements associated with yang, whereas the earth and water representing our manifest, very solid physical existence for earth, and water being the more emotional depth, the kind of the emotional material of our experience, as being feminine qualities. There's a archetypal connection there of the masculine being the transcendent, and the feminine being the material. And it's also kind of interesting because you could draw a connection to this too, because there's a lot of religion, especially with monks and things like that, there's the idea of abstinence, or being somewhat removed from the material world, in the sense of being in a hermitage or a monastery, and having some vows of celibacy and whatnot. And this all plays off this archetype where of a kind of a masculine principle of trying to escape this duality. Well, it's not even, it's not really escaping the duality at all. I mean, I got my words wrong. It's more of like just going off into this one side of the duality, which is a transcendent, detached kind of experience of life. And this whole thing of, you can see this in ideas of that it's all just a dream, it's all just an illusion, and you just sort of you don't get too mixed up in the goings on of everyday life, and you focus on your spiritual detachment, and do your thing, your devotion in the monastery or something like that, and that's a kind of a yang kind of spirituality. And then opposed to that, or the opposite of yin, is the idea of the materiality. And this is kind of interesting because this is kind of like the archetypal conflict of kind of patriarchal bias, and this is, I think, it's a kind of interesting territory to get into because not to with people. It's like, do I dare say Jordan Peterson's name, basically, as if he's Voldemort or something, right? But there's a certain, I don't like that. There's a kind of Jungian thing that's a I don't know. I don't even want to go to the whole Jordan Peterson myth, but I think that it's interesting to look at the mythology or the archetypal qualities that underlie this kind of like masculine versus feminine conflict that we see, and it's sort of like underlying a lot of the attitudes of the church, which used to have, I mean, maybe it still has maybe it doesn't have quite a grip on society as it used to, but it still underlies a lot of the ways we've developed our cultural attitudes around things, where the idea of like the kind of, to be like a kind of, well, I don't know. There's sort of like the idea of perhaps the shadow side of the yin aspect of getting too involved in material life, and that's represented in a kind of the puritanical attitude against things like pleasure, indulging in things like food and drugs and sex and money and all this kind of stuff. Which is also interesting because the Venus archetype, relating to not just relationship and love, but things which you value, and even even if these are even principles, you could say, are still somewhat material in comparison to a kind of very transcendent spiritual kind of thing. But like the love of money and the love of food and the love of getting involved in the earthly kind of thing going on in life, that was seen. I mean, it's not it's not meant to be a literalistic thing, like that's something that only women do. That would be too simplistic of a way to look at it, but that is seen as the feminine quality of existence, whereas the masculine quality is the sort of like, why they're creating the Christian God as a masculine figure, as being something heavenly and separate from the kind of earthly thing which was seen as feminine. And what's interesting about all this kind of stuff is that people were drawing a connection from these kinds of attitudes, which was a bias against the earthly, worldly quality in favor of a kind of transcendent detachment, connecting that to what we're seeing with the environmental destruction that is happening in the world. Although it's kind of a complicated subject, because you could, I guess, say that so much of our environmental destruction is driven by greed, or driven by the exploiting the environment for this or that or whatever. But there's also the kind of like there's kind of a philosophical problem in this sort of cosmology, where it's like, if, let's say, you're totally transcendent and you accept that, like the Buddhism would say, that everything is impermanent and it all comes and goes, and even the planet we live on at one point in time didn't exist, right? Even the Earth has not been around for all eternity, and so human beings haven't been around for all eternity. And if you're just completely detached, and as they say, you're in the Bible, you put your treasures where moth and flame or moth and rust do not corrupt in heaven, rather than on earth where everything is subject to decay and all that kind of stuff, and you're really not invested in the worldly affairs, then if if everything goes haywire and all all the life on planet Earth gets wiped out, then like, oh well, that's just how it goes. It's kind of like a detached. There's a risk of apathy about the whole thing, right? And there's also, in another sense, with this kind of dynamic, there's the risk of too much of that yang kind of transcendent personality. There's a risk of depersonalization, a risk of spiritual bypass, a risk of avoiding the your own earthly existence and all this kind of thing, which is also kind of missing the point of it, right? Like, as if it's kind of like the whole attitude that it may just be a dream, it may just be an illusion, as if all this stuff in this manifest physical world that we live in was just here by some funny accident, and it was like, oh well, so you have all the this whole dream-like illusion of all human history and life and animals and galaxies upon galaxies of things that have been created. It's just kind of like, oh, that's actually not important at all. It's just a distraction. it's sort of like, well, there's got to be something more to it than that, you would think, right? Like, so it's the idea of, but most people are actually much more, well, I guess it's not so much as simple as just saying you're either going in one direction or the other, but a lot of people they have these two elements. It's the way they're kind of interplaying with each other and all this kind of thing, relating the whole. I mean, I guess the whole point, going back to my original point about non-duality versus duality, is that relating to these things as you're to either say on one hand transcend it all and just sort of like as what the New Agers would call like ascension, right? Like just ascend out of 3D world into 560 70 into total you're just energy light being, versus being your lower vibration reality or whatever that the whole New Age, or I don't know, but whatever that kind of style of spiritual attitude is that the if like you would say that if there are whatever different planes of reality, different maybe instead of thinking about it as different levels, you graduate up and you can just leave stuff behind and not worry about it. Maybe it doesn't really work like that. Maybe it's more like the layers of an onion, or that all of it is right here, right now, all the layers, all the dimensions you could possibly access, and the point isn't to somehow just pick the good one and leave the shitty one behind, because you get hot and you get cold and you get a cold, you come down with the flu, or shitty politicians get elected, so you just want to leave that behind for something that that in your imagination seems like everything will just be chill and you don't have to worry too much. It's that actually none of this is separate. It's that and that I would say it was really what the non-dual thing is. And when you get to that point, the whole premise of whether you to transcend or really get involved in your life, it's not even really a question. It's just that you're just because I do like things like the be here now or the power of now approach to things, because it's really like, where are you, where do you think you're gonna go anyways, aside from whatever is right here, right now, whatever is happening. There's nothing you're not gonna escape to any heaven that isn't right in front of you right here. And when you do see that, it's not gonna be at all separate from whatever you would dualistically decide is not heaven, right? So that the heaven you're looking for is the earth, and the earth that you're on is the heaven. And as they say in one of my favorite Zen scriptures, the verses on the faith mind, that you make the slightest distinction in your mind, and heaven and earth is set infinitely apart. But it's all in your mind. It's all just whether you're having a dualistic attitude towards life or not. So this is my epic ramble on duality, and I managed to whatever. There we go.